بسم الله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وبعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته شيخنا. Thank you so much for giving us your time tonight. May Allah reward you, elevate your status, make it sincere, accept it from you, and use you for His sake and never replace you, inshallah. So Sheikhna, one of the questions that, throughout our conversations we've been having, that comes to mind as at the center of this issue is, how do you approach desecularized education at a level that's not simply isolated case by case, but at a systemic level where you can apply like ISO standards, international standards of education? How do you approach it at that level where then you can, propagate that across the world within the Muslim countries, let alone just within our diasporic Western communities?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu rasulillah. So it's a big question, and there's a lot of dimensions to the answer. One of the things is to realize the patterns upon which Islam has been secularized as something to be taught. And there are at least two prominent consequences or outcomes of the secularization of Islamic knowledge. And one has been what I've dubbed the theology of suffering, and the other is what I've dubbed the theology of the state. Okay, so the theology of suffering is sort of a quietist position when it comes to everything that happens to the Muslim world. All we have to have is a fatalistic sort of relationship to it. We have to submit. And if we are to resist it in any way, shape, or form, then this is actually expressing displeasure with Allah's decree. And the other would be the theology of the state, which is to say that you have to obey the ruler no matter what, and that you don't have any room to critique. So the secularization of Islam has been a paring down of Islam to fit within four walls of a masjid and five pillars. It's the privatization of Islam. It's the Protestant Reformation type of Islam. So there's a couple avenues through which to reclaim the full holistic nature of Islam when we teach it, and then take it beyond that to talk about knowledge in general. And one of them is to talk about the furud kifaya. Okay, to what are the collective obligations that we have, and what are the avenues of influence that Islam not only can but should exert upon the societies in which we find ourselves. These kind of mandates, some people talk about the cultural mandate. Well, Islam also has a political mandate, right, that defies this sort of secularization. Another thing to do is to teach the history of ideas, the intellectual history of the West, which then parochializes this sort of type of accounting for history and what Islam is. And makes seem small the type of secularized, privatized faith, and shows us that the origin of the word religion is the same as the meaning of deen, which is that it's based on an obligation. Yeah, religio means that the duty that is rendered unto your Lord. Before, it meant something that was a jins, right, a category of human experience in the Blakean sense, or the sense of the deists. That now we could say that one species of this genus is Islam and another species is Christianity. That's a very modern way of understanding it. So recovering these things, or at least mapping out conceptually how these concepts have changed over time. And also the intellectual history of Islam itself, to show that just very, very obviously has escaped these types of categories. Articulating conceptual categories is very, very important, because you can't outthink something that you can't formulate language for, right? So language being the vessel of these ideas, but we have to make sure that sometimes we're going to need to coin new terminology, right, in order to describe the reality that has happened, or to figure our way out of a reality that's been created by the shifts in terminology and language and conceptions that have happened. That takes us only down one part, so I'm sure you got some follow-up questions for that.
No, definitely. So, Jazakallah khair for that. That's really good at a higher level in terms of, say, for instance, we could teach sociology like this, we could teach history like this. That's all good. But how do you do ihya al-ulum? How do you revive the sciences in general? When I mean sciences, I just don't mean the Islamic sciences. I mean, how do you teach math, biology, chemistry, physics to grade school, middle school, in a way that is resuscitating it with the theory that we're talking about here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's where the reintroduction of the moral dimension is the first step, and maybe the most significant step, because right now these things are purely instrumentalized in the sense that they become ends in and of themselves. You do math just to do math, and you develop disciplines, you develop sort of theory, and it's just about pushing the cutting edge and expanding. And it's a very expansionist and positivist endeavor where you think that everything that could be known, we will one day find it, and we just is the march of human knowledge going forth. And that's a very atheistic and naturalistic and materialistic way in which to view knowledge. So we have to understand that all of these sciences are meant to serve other than well, even the Quran and the Sunnah, right? You know, sometimes we have the bifurcation of ulum al-ala, right, or ilm al-ala versus ilm al-matlub, or these things. But even those things, you would just say that they are tools to get to paradise. They're tools of salvation. But I think that within an Islamic metaphysics, every single intellectual discipline has to serve a moral end. Right. And I think that that's the key correction. Where that leads you is a kind of interesting place, because then it's like mathematics, there's moral mathematics, there's immoral mathematics. And no, seriously, then you have to tether your mathematics to moral outcomes and pursuits. And the same with sciences, and the same with humanities, and then you can actually uncover new disciplines that further those pursuits, which is actually how disciplines in the Islamic world and civilization used to come about, right? So realizing that there are things that we have not invented yet that can't, because invention is not the problem. The problem is along what lines are things being invented. That to come up with the most barbaric way of torturing, or even more barbaric ways of killing each other, is an atheist materialist sort of endeavor. Whereas to continue to innovate on the means of delivering public goods and services and solving needs of people, and to respond to the intellectual challenges of our time with new disciplines that need to be articulated, like from an Islamic frame, like that is something that absolutely that we need to be doing, right? So we have the ihya. Okay, who's going to write the ihya of our time? And what would it be? And what would it address? And what would it correct? And what would it invent that's going to displace the things that have hegemony currently?
That makes a lot of sense. Again, maybe if you could give some examples as to what moral math would take forward, and that might be too particular, but in general, how would it look like in discovering new fields?
Absolutely. So, for example, like if you look at mathematics, mathematics is tied to economics, okay, inherently. We live in an era in which commodification is not just rampant, but it's accelerating and it's unhinged. So we are finding more and more things to sell, things that were unsellable before. Okay, now this is a moral and existential threat to us, because certain things shouldn't be sellable. And actually, even if in a strict juz'i, like fiqhi sense, maybe it's permissible, the overall erosion that it does to Islamic values and to Islamic civilization is significant. Okay, so take the principle of economics. Okay, like what's the basic that I teach you in Econ 101 micro? I teach you that it's the allocation of scarce resources, or the most efficient allocation of scarce resources, and it's founded on assumptions such as competition, such as rational interest, such as selfishness, all of these things. So maybe what we need to look at applied mathematics and econ as like an applied mathematics field to envision what it would take to flip and reverse this. What if, like, those are very metaphysical assumptions. Yeah. Like, what if we start with the assumption of bounty? What if we start with the assumption of duty? What if we start with the assumption of ta'awun, of mutual aid? We start with the assumption of you are not a believer if you go to bed satiated and your neighbor is hungry and you know about it. All the things that we have in our deen. And then we instrumentalize the mathematics in order to discover the most godly, pardon the colloquial phrase, but the most sacred or holy or praiseworthy religiously way to allocate Allah's abundance, right? Or the most impactful way to alleviate poverty, or the most impactful way to invest community resources to produce the most scholars, right? These are all mathematical ends, okay? And there's opportunity cost to everything that is pursued. So for every useless sort of mathematical theory that comes out that is, taking up time from and energy and resources from doing this other type of work.
That's beautiful. MashaAllah. All right, let me make it even a little bit more challenging. Grade 5, you're being introduced to algebra, introduced to the sciences. How do you desecularize them at that level? How do you teach it at that level?
It's easier with the younger people because they have fitra, more so than when you get older. So actually, this is a really great challenge. I still teach middle schoolers, and I think that people need to teach middle schoolers just to keep their feet on the ground so they don't get run away with their jargon and things of that nature. That you can really capitalize on a lot of intuition and intuitive moral logic that Allah creates us with, because the intuition that we have in the fitrah is like an intuition for morality. It's really fascinating. That takes programming to wipe out of people. So yeah, I mean, you can totally capitalize that when it comes to science class and the sorts of things. Let's take science class. Now, what do you learn in science as a fifth grader? And then you learn about atoms, and you learn about, it's a very material, okay, juz'i, mechanistic. It's very mechanistic, okay. Children are very idealistic naturally. How many times has a young child passed by a homeless person on the street and wondered, Mama, Papa, why can't we bring them into our home? Right? They haven't been trained yet to realize that that's not socially acceptable, and it could be risky and it could be dangerous, right? So they have a certain idealism that actually should be harnessed at that age. And so if you are a child and you can, or if you're teaching children and you're able to say, okay, well, here's the world that we've inherited. Here are the problems. We've got, medications, pharmaceuticals in our water, and we've got pollution over here, and our food is getting less nutritious every year, and we've got food deserts, and we've got this. You can have interesting conversations about what a science would look like that is predicated upon doing God's work on earth, sort of a khilafatullah sort of thing, right? And then you can reverse engineer it to get into the mechanisms that would help you get that. But the thing is that if you skip over the aghrad, if you skip over the purposes for which why do you think that most kids, unless you go to a really good school, not the one I went to, you go to an average public school in the West, you're in 8th grade and you can't remember what you studied in elementary. You can't remember anything. That shows the failure of that type of education, that children have an amazing amount of solidarity and compassion to them, that they can, write letters and appeal to, politicians or appeal to other people. They have a moral voice. They have a moral clarity that sometimes we lack. So even the whole, why are we teaching them? Let's imagine this. So we take a 5th grader and we're teaching them algebra. Let's take the math track. Okay. So you're going to teach them arithmetic until a certain point, and then you're going to teach them geometry, and you're going to teach them, trigonometry and pre-calc and calculus. And there's a sort of seerah that you go through that is sort of laid out ahead of you. But what's the purpose of it? Right? What is it designed to solve? And that's what we have to question. It's like what would a mathematics curriculum look like that was tied to divine commands and ta'ah, to obedience of Allah? Is that seerah going to change? Do we just teach skills without teaching the moral wielding of those skills? Do we delay? What's the number one complaint about math in any public school? I don't get the point of this. Why am I studying this? What's the point? Right? Do we bypass that and tell them, well, if you can stick with it until you can get a good paying job, you can blow bits off of kids across the world with your math skills, and then you'll have a safe career, which is really what happens now, versus intervening at that level and saying, we're going to get it down from the beginning that everything that we do has a purpose, and that purpose is moral, and that purpose is going to actually serve your salvation by doing something that pleases your Lord, whether it's arithmetic, whether it's geometry, whether it's algebra, whether it's whatever. And that, I think, clarifies and focuses like what we're supposed to be doing.
It's beautiful, mashallah. So if we were to put it in a way, you're trying to give gravity and centrality to the purpose of knowledge here itself, even at that level. So if you can make it Allah-centric, tawheed centric, if you can put the purposes first, you'll be able to make sense of the math that doesn't make sense to kids in school.
Yeah.
Okay. Subhanallah. Subhanallah. So then, if, like, are there efforts out there that are trying to work on such types of visionings of knowledge?
Well, there's been efforts such as the Islamicization of knowledge movement that comes out of Malaysia and other similar efforts. They move like Islamic political movements move. There's a wave, and the initial wave is maybe preliminary and somewhat immature. And then it's sort of refined, and then there's a second wave, and it gets more refined and sophisticated. And so we're still coming with those waves. We haven't cracked the nut yet, but there's a lot of people who are passionate about this, and there, I think, are a lot of good people out there. So we haven't solved it or figured it out in such a way where we're ready to apply it, but I think that people are starting to realize how superficial some attempts in the past have been to Islamicize knowledge, where they still are predicated upon secular understandings of what Islam is, the secular bifurcation of deen and dunya, in the sense that Islam is a waste bin category, or Islamiyat are a waste bin category, and the real subjects are math and science and these sorts of things. Like, we understand, people are starting to normalize the idea of that everything is Islam, right? Your math is your Islam, your science is your Islam, and taking that seriously at a fundamental level. We haven't yet seen the results of that, but we're getting to a point of high motivation, I think, on those fronts.
Because usually one of the cop-outs for this type of thinking or pushing forward is you're taking away from science what makes it science, which is its push towards progress and material success, by replacing it with scaffolding and barriers to hold it back from true ingenuity and progress.
Yeah, I mean, there is no such thing as progress. Like, there's only progress towards the afterlife and towards Jannah. So, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, this sort of conversation makes us choose whether we want to think like atheists or think like Muslims. And it's scary for certain people, especially who have been indoctrinated with the theology of progress and, material comfort, material success. But that's not what we're going for. And that's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. I think that we are starting to, thankfully, shed the very superficial cop-outs that we have come up with to escape this problem, where we say, oh, well, Allah wants us to have ihsan in everything, and therefore I should go be a nuclear physicist that can blow up children across the world, or I can work for Lockheed Martin or Boeing. Or I think that most people are not satisfied with such pathetic, superficial sloganeering anymore. So, rather than tokenize Islam and use Islam as sort of a legitimizing talisman to just give a rubber stamp to our otherwise materialistic ends, I think that at least people in the education sphere, I always kind of keep a finger or two on what's going on in the education sphere, people are starting to realize that we need to treat this much more systematically and much more, at a much more core level than just hoping that everybody succeeds in math and science and pretend we're doing Islam along the way.
Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh. Allah yajzik al khair wa yabarak fiik. I do apologize for playing devil's advocate for a little bit, but it needs to be done, right? Yeah. Okay, last piece of advice for the youth out there in university, in high school, who feel this constant tug of war, this battle of ideals and vision within life, where they're battling on one side their shahawat, on the other the hidden curriculum and indoctrination. What would you say to them when it comes to trying yourself to educate yourself in a manner that's instructive in this path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Yeah, we're all like that Bollywood movie with Amir Khan, where he wakes up and he doesn't have any memory, so he has all and I'm aware that was based off of a Hollywood movie as well. I can't remember the names of any of these movies, but I use that often as an illustration for our coming into the world, because you enter into the world at a certain point in a conversation, and it's a philosophical conversation, it's an ideological conversation, it's a historical conversation. So everybody has a certain duty to figure out where we're at in that conversation and to infer what has already been said, and then to meaningfully intervene in that conversation through your life and the decisions that you make. That you can be just a chump that continues along the path of least resistance. That's very easy. It's very comfortable to do that. But you will have neglected your duty if you did that, to be something more, to be someone who is a transformative contributor and a real sort of khalifa, like somebody who is doing Allah's work on earth as He would like it to be done. So everybody has to accept that struggle and not run away from that struggle. I think a lot of the internal cognitive dissonance that a lot of people fight with or run away from is trying to avoid that struggle. I think that we should embrace struggle in that sense, that life is essentially this good versus evil tugging, the purpose versus purposelessness tugging, like, it's red pill, blue pill. It's the matrix. You can go along with the matrix, or you can step outside of the matrix. And Muslims, we have a mandate to step outside of the matrix.
جزاك الله خيرا ويبارك فيكم ويرفع قدركم إن شاء الله. May Allah bless you, elevate your status.